Good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the seminar on euthanasia organized by the CUHK Center for Bioethics. Now, I would like to pass the time to our center co-directors, Professor Roger Chung and Dr. Ann Lau, to kick off the event. Professor Chung and Dr. Lau, please.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning and good evening, because this is a hybrid seminar, and we're very, very excited to be here because it has been a while. So welcome, everybody. Whoever is here physically, we really welcome you. We're really happy to see your faces over here. And whoever is joining through Zoom, although we cannot see your face, but we feel your presence here. So Dr. Ann Lau and I are very privileged to be the co-directors of the Center for Bioethics. So with the support of our very generous donor, Dr. Eka Jang, and also our center advisors and other stakeholders, the Center for Bioethics was set up in 2015 with the aim to be a hub for discussions and resources and development of public health, healthcare, biomedical ethics for researchers, for educators, and policymakers alike, domestically and also beyond. So last year, in 2022, March, we took up as co-directors, and we, from our predecessor, Dr. Derek Au, with his unbinding support with the center. And he's here with us today as the moderator. So let's give a big hand to Dr. Derek Au for his leadership. And he is still serving as the center advisor. So there are some really exciting projects that our center is going to be taking. Primarily, we can split them up into three categories, I would say, three main directions. Number one is education. Number two is research. And number three is public engagement. So you know, there's some really exciting work that we're doing in terms of education. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, definitely, Roger. So basically, the Center for Bioethics was established in 2015, and since then we was actively engaged in the development and also the delivery of the bioethics education for our medical students. As a continuous effort to promote bioethics education, we are actually having a very, very exciting project in the coming year, which we hope can promote bioethics education, not just for the students in the Faculty of Medicine, but also to the students outside the Faculty of Medicine.
Right.
But of course, we believe that the conversation of bioethics should not be just limited to at the university level. So we are also trying to rolling out some very exciting and also interesting projects with the community. And the first pilot group that we are actually targeting to is the secondary school community.
That's
we have identified some partners that we are going to roll out our outreach and also workshops with the secondary school students in the coming, the coming workshop will be in a few weeks' time.
Right, and also there's something quite, I would say, well, for me it's also quite exciting because what we're also trying to do is to combine bioethics education, the science of it, and also art form, right? So one of the things that we're trying to do this year is to put out the stage production of a musical about end-of-life care and life and death matters. So hopefully we'll see you guys there. I hope that you will all support such a meaningful project, because we believe that a lot of things that is in bioethics, the nuances, the discussions can be enhanced by storytelling, by actually seeing these scenarios right in front of you. I believe that it will really facilitate really good discussions on this really, well, sometimes controversial, but always interesting topic, always relevant to our lives. And thirdly, research, we're also taking new directions, and especially on end-of-life care research, which is going to be the topic of today's seminar. So again, we welcome everybody. We're looking forward to this very fruitful discussions. And today we, not only I will be giving a presentation, we also have Dr. John Zhang, who is the postdoctoral fellow of our center, who joined just several months ago. And we also have Professor Han-Lam Lee. You can see his face over here right now, but later on you'll be able to see his face, of course. So he'll be dialing in. And also Professor Nancy Jacker from the United States, also joining in from her side of the world. And so I'm very excited. How about you?
Excited. So why not just we pass the time over to the speakers then?
Okay. So let's pass the time to our moderator for today, Dr. Derek Au.
Thank you, Roger. Today we have, in this seminar on euthanasia, we have a rather full program with 4 speakers. And I'm going to introduce them in 2 parts. The first 2 speakers now, and then after the first 2 lectures, then I'll introduce the 3rd and 4th speakers. For the first speaker, well, perhaps needs no introduction. He just spoke to you. Professor Roger Chung is a social epidemiologist, and he uses the lens of biomedical ethics and justice to examine social determinants of health and health inequities. He is the associate professor of the School of Public Health and Primary Care in CHK, co-director of the center with Anne, and also he's the associate director of the CHK Institute of Health Equity. He is also the inaugural U.S. National Academy of Medicine International Health Policy Fellow, studying the issue of health inequity and social determinants, health longevity, and also global vaccine policies. He has had more than 100 peer-reviewed international publications and has been awarded with handsome amount of research fundings to do his research with his co-investigator. Today he's going to present on the topic, development of end-of-life and palliative care in Hong Kong. Our second speaker would be Dr. John Zhang. Roger just mentioned that he's currently a postdoctoral fellow in our center, and he received his PhD degree from the Faculty of Law in the University of Hong Kong by studying the theories of punishment and developed a new forfeiture thesis in justifying the moral right to punish from Kantian perspective. Dr. Zhang also used to study in the Department of Philosophy in Sun Yat-sen University in mainland China, and he acquired a bachelor degree from the Oklahoma State University before coming back to Hong Kong to study his PhD. He's particularly interested in topics about right to life and human dignity, and is currently studying the moral justification of the liberal view of euthanasia and also the moral issues and permissibility of physicians' participation in capital punishment. He will present on the topic research on assisted dying and euthanasia in Hong Kong and Asia. I think that's based on a literature review and also some discussions. So this would be the first 2 speakers, and now I'll come back to introduce the 3rd and 4th. So now may I pass the mic to Roger again to present his talk.
So I'll be talking about the development of end-of-life care and palliative care in Hong Kong and some of the things that we have learned. So I think everybody can treat this as some kind of a survey presentation that is just trying to give a backdrop of what is happening, and this this presentation will kind of set the stage for what is to come for the rest of today's seminar. So this topic is based on a book chapter that Dr. Derek Au and I co-wrote recently to be published in a textbook edited by Ben Fong called Gaps and Actions in Health Improvement, Health for All and All for Health. So this is Hong Kong, populated by 7.4 million of predominantly Chinese ethnicity and some ethnic minorities. Hong Kong is a city. right? So for some of you who are joining internationally, here's a little bit of Hong Kong, right? So where the cultures of the East and the West meet due to its social political history. In particular, it was a former British colony since 1841, and it's become a special administrative region of China since 1997. So due to this history of colonial rule, the healthcare system in Hong Kong has some similarity to the UK. This is also called the so-called dual-track system, comprising a public and a private sector. The public sector is tax-based, historically modeled after the UK NHS, which is the National Health Service, however lacking a well-developed primary care arm, we would say. In 1990, the Hospital Authority was established through statutory legislation to bring the former government hospitals and NGO-run subvented hospitals under one roof for management and reform. During the post-World War II period, we also see the rise of Hong Kong as an important financial hub of the world. Along with it, rapid socioeconomic development, and Hong Kong has experienced this really accelerated epidemiologic transition from communicable to non-communicable diseases as the leading causes of death. And its life expectancy, as you can see in the slide over here, at birth, have been steadily increasing and overtaken Japan, the traditional champion of the health indicators since 2010. So as you can see over here, this is the crossing point where Hong Kong has overtaken Japan. On average, Hong Kong people, men and women in Hong Kong, could live on average for over 85 years. So for men, it would be 83.4 years, and for women, it would be 87.7 years. Now, as you can see here, because we have long life expectancy, the population of Hong Kong is also seriously aging, as you can see in this graph, which I'm not going to go into details. Now, with an aging population, we also need to talk about the end-of-life care, the end of our lives, and death and dying. According to Economist Intelligence Unit's Quality of Life Index in 2015, which measured the quality of end-of-life care in 5 categories. This is it. This is the report that you're looking at. So the 5 categories include palliative and healthcare environment, human resources, affordability of care, quality of care, and also community engagement. Hong Kong was ranked number 22 in the overall score behind other developed Asian economies of, say, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, as well as its former sovereignty state, the UK. Now, even though Hong Kong's healthcare system consists of a public and a private sector, and that the tax-based public sector is modeled after the NHS, the situations of end-of-life care are quite different. For instance, over 90% of death in Hong Kong actually happen in the hospitals, while in the UK it's around half, right? 48.5%. So several weaknesses of Hong Kong's healthcare, end-of-life care, were actually highlighted today, and we'll talk, a summary of those. And as you can see here, this is what the Economist report has actually highlighted. And in this report, right, they talk about palliative care being moderately developed. Medical curriculum exposes students to the subject, but a lot of the courses are actually not compulsory. Accreditation is being given for physicians, but not for the nurses. DNA CPR has no legal standing, that is, do not resuscitate yet. And most people have limited understanding about palliative care, as highlighted in this Economist report, okay? But I would say the relatively short profile of Hong Kong in this report only kind of scratched the surface of the issues at hand. So in 2015, the Food and Health Bureau, now called Health Bureau, of the Hong Kong government, commissioned our School of Public Health and Primary Care to conduct a 3-year research project on the quality of healthcare for the aging, of which a significant portion was dedicated to identifying the situations, the gaps, and the issues of end-of-life care for older persons with terminal illness and life-limiting conditions. So I was part of that research group, of which it was led by Professor E.K. Yo at that time. And the final report is now publicly available. And this is how the final report actually looks like if you go to their website. And the major findings were disseminated through several publications. And so therefore, here, I would like to highlight some of those issues. And if you want to read in details, we have also published the findings, especially on the gaps and the issues of end-of-life care in this journal back in 2020. So here is a summary of those barriers and issues, and we have used a social ecological model to kind of put them into different levels, right? So let's start with the policy and legal level gaps and issues. First of all, there's a lack of overarching policy framework for end-of-life care in Hong Kong. There's ambiguity in some of the legal basis for mental incapacity and the legislative barriers for advanced directives. There's limited power of guardians in end-of-life treatment decisions and inadequate capacity of residential care homes for the elderly to care for end-of-life patients due to limited legal requirements. On a community level, there's a lack of consistent patient-centered approach that avoids gaps and overlaps of services and oversees the delivery of care to each individual. There's also insufficient resources and equipment and support for caregivers at home and also in the institution, in the community. On an institutional level gaps and issues, we have inadequate knowledge, training, resources of end-of-life and palliative care in the healthcare sector as well as in the social care sector. There's also inadequate and appropriate transportation for end-of-life care patients to extended care or subacute care facilities. There's also inadequate medical and social interface and coordination, and also inadequate awareness of concepts like advanced care planning and advanced directive in the public healthcare and social care systems. There's also inadequate and inappropriate emphasis, coverage, and provision of bereavement and decedent care. Finally, on an interpersonal and interpersonal level, there's also general reluctance and fear of the topics of death and dying still in Hong Kong, and also the interpretation of filial piety, 即係孝順, to resemble the practice of doing everything possible for dying family members. So this summarized some of those gaps and issues at multiple levels for terminal illness and life-limiting conditions among older persons in Hong Kong. Now with that, I would like to talk about the latest developments of end-of-life care, because after the report, the commission report that we've worked on, there's several important, I would say, developments, major developments after the publication of that report. The first one that I would like to talk about is the Strategic Service Framework for Palliative Care in the Public Healthcare Sector in 2017 of the Hospital Authority. So in 2017, they have issued this guideline for further development of adult and pediatric palliative care services in the next 5 to 10 years. Right? The overall goal of the framework was to outline the strategies to address existing issues and improve service quality so that all patients with life-threatening and life-limiting conditions and also their family members and carers could receive, number one, timely, coordinated, and holistic palliative care for their physical and psychosocial and spiritual needs, and also being given opportunities to participate in the planning of their care so as to improve, enhance, or slow down the deterioration of their quality of life till the end of their life journey. And they're doing this through strategic directions that I'm not really going to go into details now. But the perceived impact and the significance are also very important, right? So it highlights the future service models that HA aspires to deliver. Okay, that's very important. You know, this is a report or a service framework that really talks about vision for the future and really calls for a fundamental shift in our care culture by advocating the type of care that goes beyond just saving lives per se, but helps patients live with comfort, dignity, and peace till the end. A second major development is the public consultation of legislation on continuing powers of attorney. So following a 2011 report on this by the Law Reform Commission of Hong Kong, the government's Department of Justice had convened an interdepartmental working group with members from the Labor Welfare Department Bureau, the Food and Health Bureau, and the Social Welfare Department. And in 2017, December, launched a public consultation on the Continuing Powers of Attorney bill in Hong Kong. So the recommendation is that they recommended extending the scope of and enduring powers of attorney to cover not only decisions on the financial and property affairs of the donor of such power, but also decisions on his or her personal care matters. Of course, in the event that they'll become mentally incapacitated. A third major development is this new and updated guidelines. These guidelines related to end-of-life care in the public healthcare sector in 2019 to 2020 at the Hospital Authority. Right? So here we have the HA guidelines on advanced care planning. Right? It was not until June 2019 that they have issued a guideline on advanced care planning, which outline details the purpose, initiation, process, scope, as well as the outcome of the ACP. Right? And also a standardized ACP form was also introduced in the guideline, and the follow-up actions needed after making of the ACP conversation were outlined. So these include safekeeping of the form, communication with stakeholders in the community, special issues to be followed up, review of ACP, signing of DNA CPR form if necessary, and the actual application of values, wishes, preferences, the stories behind, right, the decisions documented during the ACP process. In parallel, there are also minor updates being made on the guidelines on DNA CPR in September 2020. Now, it should be noted that the DNA CPR guidelines, when first issued in 2014, was in itself a major update of a pre-existing DNR guidelines issued in HA hospitals since 1998. So these, in 2016, this was further updated with new addition of a set of new guidelines, and then in 2020, those are the minor updates focusing on aligning categories of applicable conditions for adult patients with AD, minors, and incompetent patients. The fourth major development is this public consultation of legislation on AD and dying in place. Right? So basically, after the commission report, okay, I have 5 minutes left. Great. Okay. So after the commission report in 2015, the FHB, now Health Bureau of the government, conducted this public consultation on legislative proposals, right? After reviewing all those recommendations we made, and they have actually received 607 written submissions. That's a lot, which show clear support on the overall direction of the government's original proposals, with opinions on some of the execution details with regards to AD and coroner's ordinance. According to these responses, the Food and Health Bureau at that time then released its consultation report, which is this one called Moving Forward. legislative proposals in July 2020 with its final legislative proposals, right? So a little bit details here, and then I will try to sum it up. In terms of AD, the government proposed that any mentally competent person aged 18 or above could make an AD to refuse life-sustaining treatment, including artificial nutrition and hydration under pre-specified conditions. They recommended the use of a non-statutory body form covering the pre-specified conditions of terminal illness, persistent vegetative state, or a state of irreversible coma and other end-stage irreversible life-limiting conditions. That means AD not made in any model form should still be accepted given that they are clearly written and not ambiguous. There are also no restrictions as to when a person could make, modify, or revoke an AD given that the person is mentally competent or not under any undue influence. So to facilitate an AD being followed outside a hospital setting, a statutory prescribed DNA CPR form is also being proposed to be used. And there are also safeguards that are introduced because they need to be provided for the treatment providers acting in good faith and with reasonable care. The government would ensure that the other relevant legislations, including those of Fire Services Ordinance, Mental Health Ordinance, and the Continuing Powers of Attorney Ordinance, Mental Health Bill being proposed but not legislated yet, would not conflict with the administration of the AD. And in terms of dying in place, amendments will be made to the coroner's ordinance to exempt the reporting requirements to the coroner if an RCHE resident, that is OH home in Hong Kong, who is diagnosed as having a terminal illness, has been attended to by a registered medical practitioner within 14 days prior to his or her death, and that a registered medical practitioner has made a final diagnosis and determined the death as being due to natural causes. So the governments basically will. There's so far, after the consultation and the report being published, and then we have 2019, 20, 21, the COVID-19 pandemic. So right now, I think we will all be looking forward to what is going to happen after the publication of this report and if there's going to be any legislative move afterwards. So let me sum it up, okay? So where do we stand right now and what is the future of end-of-life care for Hong Kong? So in summary, how many minutes do I have left? 1, okay, all right. Let me try to be quick, okay? So this is just to set the stage again, right? So in summary, the Government Commission study on end-of-life care conducted in 2017 had identified all those various barriers, gaps of end-of-life care, made recommendations accordingly. Hong Kong has since then seen several major relevant developments, okay? And on an institutional level, for example, the strategic service framework and the guidelines in the HA are trying to take care of that, and the legislation proposal and law reform are tackling the barriers on a legal level. But there are still gaps, right? So there needs to be more resources and capacity, such as primary care doctors, healthcare professionals, trained in palliative care, training for informal carers, accessibility to medical resources. They're all needed in the community, and also there needs to be more interpersonal and interpersonal level efforts to address those social and cultural gaps, right? So concerted efforts are needed, and we can't really work in silos. Okay, this is my last slide. The government can't really work alone on end-of-life care. They must co-op and collaborate with various stakeholders in the community. And because, due to the multidisciplinary effort, the nature of it being multidisciplinary and multi-level and interconnected of these problems. Therefore, we should capitalize on the current momentum to develop an end-of-life care system that is ethical, fair, sustainable, and of international standard in Hong Kong. So with that, I acknowledge all my colleagues, all the teammates of this research, all the center staff, my colleagues, and also advisors. of the center and the donor of the center. These are my references. Thank you very much. So let me
Thank you, Roger.
give the time. Should I give the
Yeah,
time to
yeah.
John directly?
John-
Okay,
John can direct.
so Dr. Zhang, he's going to talk about, now we're going to I've zoomed into Hong Kong. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit, right? We're going to talk about, well, what are some of those research and what do they say in terms of euthanasia, which is a huge topic, a contentious one, in Asia, in some of these Asian countries. Okay, so let me give the time to Dr. Zhang.
I'm glad to have this opportunity to present my literature review on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia in Hong Kong and Asia. In this presentation, I will first define the concept of different sources of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Secondly, I will talk about the legal status of euthanasia in Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and mainland China. Thirdly, I will discuss people's attitude toward euthanasia in this place and the demographic association with their attitudes. Finally, I will briefly summarize the findings from my literature review and discuss the findings in my own words. And the definition of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Euthanasia is an act of bringing about the death of another person for the reason that this person's quality of life has become so deteriorated that he would be better off dead. From the perspective of physician's agency, there could be two kinds of euthanasia: active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia means that some positive acts are taken deliberatively to end the patient's life, such as lethal injection. Passive euthanasia means that physicians refrain from doing anything to keep the patient alive, such as withdrawing or withholding life-sustaining treatments. From the perspective of patient's agency, there could be three kinds of euthanasia: voluntary euthanasia, non-voluntary euthanasia, and involuntary euthanasia. Voluntary euthanasia means that patients consent to be euthanized via the exercise of their autonomy. Non-voluntary euthanasia means that euthanasia is performed under the circumstance that patients are unable to express their consents, such as when they fall into irreversible coma or they become unconscious. Involuntary euthanasia means that euthanasia is performed on the ones who object to be killed. The literature review in this presentation will not cover involuntary euthanasia, which is generally regarded as homicide or manslaughter. Meanwhile, physician-assisted suicide is often discussed generally together with euthanasia. Physician-assisted suicide occurred when lethal drugs are prescribed or supplied by the physician at the patient's request and self-administered by the patient with the end of ending his or her life. Given that active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are performed out of respect for patients' autonomy to end their life, many theories believe that there is no moral difference between two practices. The legal status of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. According to the guideline from Hospital Authority, it is legally permissible to withdraw or withhold fetal treatments in Hong Kong. However, Hong Kong government distanced the permission from the permission for euthanasia because it does not consider the withdrawal of the fetal treatment as an act of euthanasia. Therefore, in Hong Kong, the term euthanasia merely refers to active euthanasia, which is strictly prohibited. In South Korea, passive euthanasia for voluntary and non-voluntary patients is legally permissible, according to the Act on Decision on Life-Sustaining Treatment for Patients. Whereas active euthanasia is also impermissible. In Japan, there is no law regarding euthanasia. There is only a guideline from a district court which has no decisive authority. According to this guideline, euthanasia is permissible only if patient is suffering unbearable pain, death is unavoidable. There is no alternative to relieve suffering, and the patient's will to accept euthanasia is clear. In mainland China, there is no law regarding euthanasia. The Article 1222 in the Civil Code of People's Republic of China implicitly expects permission for passive euthanasia. According to this article, where consent of a patient or his close relative cannot be obtained in the case of rescuing a terminally ill patient or in another emergency situation, upon the approval of the person in charge of the medical institution or an authorized person in charge, the corresponding medical measure may be taken immediately. Many legal scholars explain that when patient or his close relative consent to give up the rescue, it is permissible for the physician to withdraw or withhold the medical measures. The euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in Hong Kong. Two research, one in 2005 and another in 2008, indicate that the general public in Hong Kong was more supportive of the request for active euthanasia than passive euthanasia. The main reason for their preference was that patients themselves and their family could be released from the sufferings in a more efficient way via active euthanasia. By contrast, the physicians in Hong Kong generally disagree with active euthanasia and support passive euthanasia. Research in 2004 suggests that 75% of the 65 respondents who work at ICU said active euthanasia was unacceptable. As regard to passive euthanasia, 70% of them prefer withholding to withdrawing therapy. Research in 2022 indicate that 46% of the 228 respondents who are medical students in Hong Kong possess good knowledge of euthanasia, and 58% of them do not support active euthanasia. This research suggests that there is no significant association between knowledge and attitude toward euthanasia among those medical students. But similar research in 2008 suggests that clinical exposure and experience-based learning has significant influence in shaping the attitude. The research in 2022 further indicate that male is more positive about euthanasia than female, and the ones who used to witness withdrawing of nutrition support from patients are more positive about euthanasia than the ones who did not. Research in 2013 found out the higher the age, the higher the support for both active euthanasia and non-voluntary euthanasia. Research in 2003 suggests that the ones who have religious belief tend to object to euthanasia, and the ones who have personal experience of caring for terminally ill patients tend to support passive euthanasia. Euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in South Korea. The research in 2011 indicated that 50% of the 1,006 respondents of the general public in South Korea support active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, while this number increased to 76% in 2021. The reason for their support for active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are meaningless of life, the right to quit death, relief from sufferings, and not being a burden to family. By contrast, the research in 2018 suggests that only 13% of the 928 physicians sampled in South Korea support active euthanasia, and 99% of them support withdrawing therapy, and 77% of them support withholding therapy. Therefore, unlike their counterparts in Hong Kong, Korean physicians prefer withdrawing to withholding therapy. The research in 2011 also suggests that the ones who support active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide tend to be elderly, male with no religious belief and low education level. whereas the ones who object to active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide tend to be religious and well-educated. More specifically, the research in 2018 found out the ones who had high education level, religious belief, and experience of caring for terminally ill patients tend to support active pain control. The ones who had high income, high education level, and experience of caring for terminally ill patients tend to support passive euthanasia. The ones who had high education level and no religious belief tend to support active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in Japan. According to a survey in 2006, when 418 respondents sampled from the general public in Japan took up the hypothetical role of the comatose patients, 73% of them did not want life-sustaining treatment, and 82% of them did not want CPR, and 79% of them did not want artificial nutrition and hydration. By contrast, a comparative study in 2002 indicated that only 23% of the 145 Japanese nurses believed that active euthanasia was morally permissible, and 14% of them would perform active euthanasia on patients if it were be legalized. This research also points out that 57% of these Japanese nurses have been asked to perform active euthanasia by their patients. The reason for the request was irreversible pain and not wanting to be a burden to family. The research in 2012 also suggests that the feeling of death was associated with the age. The younger the patient are, the more fear of death they feel. The research in 2006 indicated that people's attitude toward active treatments was associated with their age, gender, and the maturity of their children. In the case of dementia, the ones who live with infant children were positive about active treatments, whereas the ones who were female and over 53 years old and living with adult children tend to give up active treatments. Euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in mainland China. According to the research in 2020, 94% of the 669 respondents sampled from the general public in mainland China possess knowledge of euthanasia. 55% of them support euthanasia. 38% are neutral toward euthanasia. 7% object to euthanasia. And 82% support the legalization of euthanasia. In the group of who support euthanasia, 71% of them support active euthanasia, and 79% of them support passive euthanasia. The reason for Chinese public to support euthanasia are the respect for the autonomy of patients and the relief of suffering. The reason for the Chinese public to object to euthanasia are missing opportunity to be cured and the prohibition given by social norms. The research in 2020 also suggests that male is more positive about euthanasia than female, but female is more positive about the legalization of euthanasia than male. The ones who had high education level tend to support euthanasia. The ones who have good health tend to support euthanasia. But the ones who have poor health are more likely to negative about euthanasia. On the contrary, Chinese healthcare professional attitude toward euthanasia tend to be negative, as to be illustrated by several studies. For example, a survey in 2013 suggests that only 46% of 563 medical students support euthanasia. Furthermore, the Chinese patients in terminal illness tend to be negative about euthanasia. The research in 2006 indicated that 2.2% of 136 cancer patients would prefer passive euthanasia, and the rest of them would prefer palliative care. According to the comparative study in 2012, 56% of 62 Chinese cancer patients would prefer artificial prolongation of life rather than passive euthanasia. When they were given a hypothesis that life-sustaining treatment were free, the number increased to 72%. This literature review found out that the physicians in East Asia generally object to active euthanasia but support passive euthanasia, while patients in different countries have different attitudes toward passive euthanasia. Male is more positive about euthanasia than female. There is a growing tendency in East Asia that the general public prefer active euthanasia than passive euthanasia. The relief of families' burden is a common reason for the patients in East Asia to prefer euthanasia. Religious beliefs have a significant association with people's negative attitude toward active euthanasia. Discussion. The physicians in East Asia generally object to active euthanasia because active euthanasia is generally illegal in East Asia, and the physician will be liable to legal punishment for breaking the law. The fact that patients in different countries have different attitudes toward passive euthanasia should be input to the different systems of health insurance in different countries. For example, when Chinese patients were given a hypothesis that the life-sustaining treatment were free, the number of choosing artificial prolongation of life increased to 72% from 56%. In China, the medical services are not free for terminal ill patients. The Chinese patient will consider the artificial prolongation of life as some kind of benefit, and consequently, they will consider giving the artificial prolongation of life up as some kind of loss. Therefore, Chinese patients are negative to passive euthanasia. The patients in countries where have universal health coverage will not consider the artificial prolongation of life as benefit, and they will be more rational in making the decision of end-of-life care. These patients tend to be positive to passive euthanasia. The growing support for active euthanasia in general public should be attributed to the increasing awareness of its existential suffering in the general public. People wish to have access to end their lives for the reason other than they suffer medical illness. Passive euthanasia is merely limited to the patients with terminal illness, and therefore, active euthanasia wins support from those who have existential sufferings. The relief of families' burden is a common reason for the patient in East Asia to prefer euthanasia, because Confucian culture in East Asia emphasized the family value. Individuals not only live for themselves, but also live their families. Religious beliefs have a significant association with people's negative attitude toward active euthanasia because religions affect one's conscience. And most religions in East Asia, such as Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity, encourage people to treasure human life and discourage people from giving their lives up. The limitation of this research is that it only revealed the literature about euthanasia practice in 4 Asian settings because of the time limit of the presentation. However, some other Asian areas where Confucian culture is popular are also worth investigation, such as Singapore, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Moreover, the English literature about Japanese attitude toward euthanasia is not as new as the literature about their counterparts in Hong Kong, mainland China, and South Korea. In addition, the distinction between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia is not always clear in the literature. This is because there is no consensus on the definition of euthanasia among 4 places. In conclusion, this literature review mainly focuses on the comparison between general public's attitude toward euthanasia and healthcare professionals' attitude toward euthanasia. Based on this comparison, it explored the demographic association with people's attitude toward euthanasia. This finding suggests that the increasing support of active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide from the general public in East Asia could push the legalization of active euthanasia. Meanwhile, the healthcare professional attitude toward active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide will be shaped by the legal status of active euthanasia. Further works need to be done to establish why the general public in East Asia increasingly support active euthanasia and whether their reasons have concrete moral basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect timing there. You have heard two really very content-rich presentations. The third speaker will be Professor Hon Nam Lee. Professor Hon Nam Lee, to PO and CHK, also needs no introduction really. He is emeritus professor in the Department of Philosophy in CHK, researching on practical ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of law. He was last year a visiting fellow at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University for the fall of 2022, and actually just came back to Hong Kong in recent months. His publications have appeared in many peer-reviewed and really esteemed journals, and some of his articles, including articles on contractualism, have been quoted as the fourth and fifth most read article published in the criminal justice ethics. His publications also include those on Rawlsian political liberalism, public reason, bioethics, and also writing on issues related to assisted suicide, such as the chapter written in the book edited by him and Michael Campbell on public reason and bioethics. He also published on this issue in the Asian Bioethics Review in 2016. Today he'll be talking on the topic on some arguments against the decriminalization of assisted suicide. Last but not least, Professor Nancy Jacob will be speaking for us, and she is the Professor of Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Washington School of Medicine and Adjunct Professor at the University of Washington School of Law, Department of Global Health, and Department of Philosophy. Professor Jacob is actually the current president of the International Association of Bioethics and serves as a member of its board of directors from 2019 to present. She holds visiting professorship at the University of Johannesburg Department of Philosophy and also at CHK. She is actually now currently our senior honorary advisor at the center and supporting the center in various ways. Professor Jacob's research explores global bioethics, justice, moral philosophy. Her research spans really across a big range from healthcare allocation to human dignity and also personhood and other issues. She will be speaking on the topic medical futility and physician-assisted death. So without further ado, may I now pass the time to Professor Hon Lee.
Open my document. Okay, is it? Can everyone see this? I hope so. Okay, great, thanks. So I'll be talking about this topic. Should physician-assisted death or suicide be legalized or decriminalized? Okay, so first of all, there are several different terms and they all refer to the same thing. First of all is the physician-assisted suicide, PAS, and physician-assisted death. I'll be adopting PAD today, and then medical assisted suicide and medical assistance in dying. They really refer to the same thing. And as Dr. Zhong already explained, but I'd like to say a little bit more about the distinction between PAD and voluntary euthanasia. Okay, PAD is usually committed by a patient with the assistance of a doctor. I mean, he or she will swallow a lethal pill and therefore die. Euthanasia, on the other hand, usually in the form of a lethal injection, is administered by a doctor. The PAD offer a terminally ill patient peace of mind in case the suffering gets too unbearable and he or she wants to die. PAD is in a way better because a patient may not really want to die. Okay. Now, however, some patients, for example, someone paralyzed or too feeble to take the lethal pill, can resort to only euthanasia. Okay, let me just say a couple of things because I don't have time to present the positive part of of this topic, and that's the reason, that's the arguments in favor of PAD. I mean, I like to say that first of all, that I myself think that PAD should be legalized or decriminalized. And as a matter of fact, more and more countries nowadays, especially if you look at the various states in Australia and the US, have legalized assisted suicide. Okay, Gerald Dawkins is a philosopher, and he says this, that ethical issues in medicine are generally very difficult, but he thinks that assisted suicide is not one of them. He thinks it's quite clear that it should be legalized. Okay, so let's be clear. We are talking about patients who are, first of all, terminally ill, with less than 6 months to live, experiencing unbearable suffering. And thirdly, they are competent adults who are persistent in wanting to die. We're not just talking about anyone. We're talking about this kind of patients. Another philosopher, David Benatar, and he says, to be forced to continue living a life that one deems intolerable when there are doctors who are willing either to end one's life or to assist one in ending one's own life is an unspeakable violation of an individual's freedom to live and to die as he or she sees fit. I myself are sympathetic with both of these views. And as I said, there are good arguments for the conclusion that PAD should be allowed. However, today I do not have time to focus on this. Instead, I'll focus only on the objections against PAD and explain why they are generally not good ones. Okay, the first objection is this: if killing is wrong, it must be wrong in all circumstances. Okay. This objection is, to my mind, highly implausible. Excuse me. Why? Because the meaning of an act really depends on the circumstances or the context in which it takes place. Let me give two examples. Example one, if John tells a lie in order to steal money from a beggar, that's clearly wrong. However, if he tells a lie in order to save Mary's life, that's totally different, even though in both cases it involves a lie. Example two, intentionally killing an innocent person who wants to die is wrong. Okay? However, to kill a malicious aggressor who's attempting to take your life is morally permissible and legally justified. Okay, so the conclusion is whether or not killing is wrong depends on the context. In this case, we are considering someone, a patient who is terminally ill, experiencing unbearable suffering, and persists in wanting to die. PAD is, or at least can be, in his or her interests. Okay, another objection is called the slippery slope argument. And there are two versions. The first version is the theoretical version. It goes like this, and I'm quoting: if there's a right to PAD, why limit it to patients dying in point of suffering? Why not extend active euthanasia to dying patients who are so feeble or paralyzed that they cannot take the pills themselves, but who beg a doctor to kill them by, say, injecting a lethal drug? And why not extend PAD to patients who are not dying, but face years of intolerable physical or emotional pain, or crippling paralysis or dependence Finally, why not extend it to anyone who has formed a desire to die, such as a 17-year-old suffering from a severe case of unrequited love? So the argument is this: if the law allows PAD, there's no natural or non-arbitrary line to draw between cases where PAD should be legalized and those where it should not be. Therefore, PAD must be either allowed or disallowed for all cases. Allowing PAD for all cases is worse than disallowing it for all cases. Therefore, PAD must be disallowed for all cases. Okay, the problem is premise 2 is pragmatic. Premise 2 says PAD must be either allowed or disallowed for all cases. Now, premise 2 is pragmatic. It is false that simply because there's no natural or non-arbitrary line separating cases that should be allowed and those that should not be, the law must either criminalize all cases or decriminalize all cases. Hey, the law should try to identify a range of cases where PAD is not wrong. Although this might be time-consuming, it is preferable that the court do this than to outlaw PAD in a blanket sort of way. It is enough that the cases are clearly marked out, and that the cases marked out are clearly cases where assistance in committing suicide is desirable. It is not necessary that every case where assistance is morally desirable should be included. Okay, so let's go to the third objection. Again, the simplest loop, but the practical version. The practical version of the simplest loop argument goes as follows. In a community, if a certain practice called A1 is allowed, then A2 will, as a matter of fact, happen, which will then lead to A3 and perhaps A4 as well. Assuming that A2 and especially A3 and 4 are highly undesirable consequences, this argument, if supported by empirical evidence, will undermine the attempt to decriminalize A1 in this particular community. Now, proponent of this argument claim that if PAD is decriminalized, it will be only a matter of time before voluntary euthanasia will be decriminalized as well. Non-voluntary euthanasia and perhaps involuntary euthanasia will eventually be legalized. They claim that voluntary euthanasia is bad, but non-voluntary and especially involuntary euthanasia are much worse. So they claim that PAD should not be legalized. However, note that voluntary euthanasia for a terminally ill patient, okay, experiencing unbearable suffering and persistent in wanting to die is not wrong, but morally permissible. Now, whether or not non-voluntary euthanasia is bad for someone or wrong for someone is depend on the context. Okay, if someone has been in coma for months with no chance of regaining consciousness, why should it be impermissible? I mean, let's say this person has no relative or no friends and so on. Involuntary euthanasia is evil. Hitler committed that by killing more than 80,000 psychiatric patients after he took power. Well, that's indisputable. Now, unlike the theoretical version, which is logically suspect, the practical version relies on empirical data. Therefore, the persuasiveness of this argument depends on whether there's any empirical evidence to support it. A scholar called Stephen Smith has looked at the empirical evidence in the Netherlands and also in the state of Oregon and concludes that there's insufficient evidence to support the practical simplest loop argument in these places. Just because the practical version might conceivably be justified in a particular community, which is, let's say corrupt and bankrupt, it does not mean that it is justified in our community. Should the law prohibit PAD because of the fear that the practical version might turn out to apply to our community? I think the answer has to be no, because we need substantiated evidence or real reason for thinking that PAD will lead to more than a few cases of involuntary euthanasia in our community, and not just the possibility that this might happen. Of course, if we talk about driving, right? Some people will drive recklessly or dangerously. It doesn't mean that driving should be prohibited. Okay, let's go to another objection, the objection called abuse and other bad consequences. One problem is psychological anxiety or pressure on the part of the patients if the physician raises the topic of PAD and euthanasia. We can resolve this problem in the following way. If PAD is legalized, a hospital will need to let eligible patients know of its availability, perhaps in the form of information sessions or pamphlets, because patients have the right to know about PAD and also the right not to opt for it. Anyone attempting to pressure a patient to choose PAD should commit a criminal offense. The law should disallow physicians to raise the topic of PAD with individual patients unless a patient raises it first. Finally, the law should require 2 non-attending physicians to authorize assisted suicide. Part of the function of this is to prevent abuse, whereas another function is to screen off those who do not genuinely want to die from those who do. Another problem under this heading, abuse, right, is this. It has to do with the suspicion that although PAD is supposed to be a last-ditch intervention, justified only after appropriate palliative options are attempted, PAD would be used before all palliative measures are utilized. Okay, in other words, people, the hospital would simply don't have to spend so much money on palliative measures. But this fear has not materialized in the Netherlands, where 2/3 of the requests for PAD or voluntary euthanasia have been rescinded, often as a result of palliative interventions. There's also little evidence in Oregon to suggest that vulnerable groups there have been given prescription for lethal medication in lieu of palliative care. On the contrary, physicians' experience with the Oregon Death with Dignity Act is that physicians are generally more aware of the patient's need to receive palliative care, and consequently, that patients tend to receive better palliative care. According to one study, physicians grant 1 in 6 requests for prescription. Excuse me. Physicians grant 1 in 6 requests for prescription for lethal medication, and that 1 in 10 of these requests actually result in suicide. So, in other words, only 1 out of 60 patients who originally wanted to die by way of assisted suicide actually did die that way. Substantive palliative intervention needs some, but not all patients, to change their minds about assisted suicide. Okay, third, a reason often used to object to PAD is that terminally ill patients, especially those from poor families, will be under pressure to opt for PAD so that their family will be relieved of the financial burden, as well as the burden to visit them. Now, there are no accurate study of the number of those who will opt for PAD because of family pressure. Moreover, one may wonder why, if such pressure exists, should a patient not seek alternative way to end her life? One such option is refusal to be saved at all. Another is the option to withdraw from life-saving equipment. Both of these options are more cruel than PAD because the pain associated with the dying process is dragged out. Okay, let me skip this page. Finally, an opponent of PAD might argue that if PAD is not legalized, one could opt for terminal sedation, which is legal in many or perhaps even most countries. In reply, many patients would not prefer terminal sedation to PAD because one's life is dragged on for a longer time, unconsciously, even if painlessly. Moreover, one might lose dignity in the process. Okay, let's go back to this objection, okay? The objection that patient would opt for PAD so that they would not, because so that they don't have to burden their adult children or their family. Okay, so this is supposed to be an objection to PAD. Now, should we reject PAD because we believe that some patients would opt for it in order not to burden their family or their adult children? Now, there are two kinds of pressure. One is the external pressure, whether it is from the hospital or society or from one's family. I think this, as I said, this kind of pressure should be criminalized. Okay, anyone who should pressure a patient to die or to adopt or to opt for PAD should be prosecuted. There's another kind of pressure. That's the internal pressure or the moral pressure from one's own moral conscience that one should die in order not to burden one's family or children. This cannot be criminalized, right? Now, we do not know, as a matter of fact, how many patients would be pressured into accepting PAD as opposed to those who would benefit from PAD. If the number are equal, surely the benefit of not having to drag through unbearable, meaningless, and seemingly endless pain and suffering is much more important, much more morally important than the wishes of those who succumb to family or hospital pressure into accepting PAD. After all, the remedy to the evil of external pressure lies in the following. First, the legal measures against undue influence on the patient to choose PAD. Second, educational sessions on the patient's right. And thirdly, screening measures to distinguish those in genuine need of PAD and those who simply feel the heat from their family or hospital. It is conceivable that there might be patients who will opt for PAD in order not to burden their children's family if PAD is decriminalized, but not if PAD is banned, out of the sense of duty. According to this objection, they will opt for PAD voluntarily. Suppose patients who would be pressured by their own conscience into choosing PAD outnumber those who would benefit from it by a factor of, say, 5 to 1. Would a ban on PAD be justified? The question, in other words, is whether those who are pressured into choosing PAD could reasonably reject the decriminalization of PAD, as well as whether terminally ill patients experiencing unbearable sufferings could reasonably reject the ban on PAD. Okay, I'm putting this in what I call the contractualist way of putting things, which rely very much on the idea of reasonable rejection. So if legal measures against external pressure are effectively implemented, can a very kind or considerate patient who does not want to burden his family but pretending to be entirely willing to choose PAD reasonably reject the decriminalization of PAD? Okay, so this is the question. I think the answer has to be no, because his decision, at least to a considerable extent, is voluntary, and hence he is responsible for his own choice for PAD. It would be a bad joke to say that this person can now reasonably reject or object to PAD. On the other hand, terminally ill patient experiencing unbearable suffering can reasonably reject a ban on PAD, if only because the suffering is unbearable and unavoidable. In sum, if adequate measures are in place, okay, the legal measure, the educational measure, and so on, a ban on PAD cannot be justified to terminally ill patient suffering unbearable, experiencing unbearable suffering, who have repeatedly asked for the life to be terminated. We owe it to them to have PAD decriminalized and make it available as an option. Okay, I do not have time to talk about the so-called argument from Hippocratic Oath, but I discuss it in this work in 154 to 156. And also this talk is based on the following published material. The two papers that Dr. Dr. Ao has very kindly referred to. And also there's another page, 215 to 218 is on a philosopher called Velleman's argument from dignity. Okay, thank you very much.
May I now invite Professor Nancy Jacker to present on the topic of medical futility and physician-assisted death. Nancy, please.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to participate in this important conversation. My presentation is entitled Medical Futility and Physician-Assisted Death. And I selected the two topics because I believe they relate to each other in ethically important ways that I hope will become clearer as I explore the following question. If life-sustaining treatment is medically futile and a dying patient requests help dying, is it permissible for the physician to provide it? And the question is framed to apply to a limited range of cases, that is only to patients that are imminently dying, who competently request assisted death, and life-saving interventions are futile. And I'm going to start things off by saying a few things about medical futility before turning to draw out the connections with assisted death. So medicine typically aims to help patients in a variety of ways. And when an intervention is futile, it has no significant prospect of doing that. Futile interventions do not prevent disease and injury, do not relieve the pain and suffering caused by disease, do not care for or cure those who are ill, prevent premature death, or help a patient die peacefully. Even if medical interventions produce effects on body parts and organ systems, if they do not benefit the patient, the person, they are medically futile. Medicine's goal, again, is not to produce effects, but to help people. Medical futility, I have argued, can be evident in two distinct ways, which I call quantitative and qualitative futility. Quantitative futility refers to the likelihood of benefits falling well below a threshold considered minimal. As an example of quantitative futility, I would offer the offering of cardiopulmonary resuscitation or CPR to patients when the chances of their survival after CPR are not better than 1 in 100. Quantitative futility draws on a standard of reasonableness. So it asks, for example, if you must treat 100 patients to benefit one, is that reasonable? Like quantitative futility, qualitative futility sets standards for medical interventions that relate to helping the patient. An intervention is qualitatively futile whenever the quality of benefit associated with the intervention falls well below a threshold considered minimal. Qualitative futility can be further specified by appealing to paradigm cases. So a prime example is continuing to provide mechanical ventilation or artificial nutrition and hydration for a patient in a persistent vegetative state. So in this instance, a patient will never appreciate any benefit from the intervention. Produces an effect, I would argue, without a benefit. Another paradigm example is an intervention that's associated with overwhelming suffering for a predictably brief period of time. And a final paradigm might be a patient who will never leave the intensive care unit and requires constant monitoring, ventilatory support, and intensive nursing care to the extent that they really can't achieve or participate in any other activities or goals of life. So with that background, let's ask the question, what does medical futility have to do with physician-assisted death? And I'm going to turn now to address this. So one possible connection is this. When physicians are by a patient's side during the course of their illness, this can establish a special relationship between the physician and the patient, and out of that relationship, a duty to help a patient end their life if they're suffering and request it might arise. Does such a duty arise? This is an old question. It's actually as old as medicine. So ancient Greek medicine warned against overtreating, seeing it as a matter of professional honesty to withdraw when interventions were futile. Yet the ancient Greeks forbid actively assisting dying. The oath attributed to Hippocrates, for example, famously states, "I will do no harm or injustice, neither will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course." Now, for the ancients, the question of whether to hasten death may have seemed less urgent than it does today, because when the doctor withdrew, the patient went home to die. Today, the practice of medicine has changed. In many economically developed countries, people die in hospitals rather than at home. And one of our prior speakers already quoted the figure that in Hong Kong, over 90% of deaths occur in the hospital. And this is even though about 30% of Hong Kongers reportedly prefer home deaths. When patients die in hospitals, physicians manage the dying process. In many respects, I believe, modern medicine has made it harder to die. When a person's heart stops beating, they can be resuscitated. When someone's lungs stop respiring, they can be ventilated. And when an individual's kidneys cease functioning, they can be dialyzed. While these interventions can extend life in positive ways, they can also make a patient miserable. One reason for holding physicians responsible for assisted dying, then, is that in many instances, physicians bear some significant responsibility for a patient's predicament. For example, when oncologists extend the lives of cancer patients with chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, artificial ventilation, and other means, they contribute to a patient's subsequent condition in the sense that absent these life-sustaining treatments, the patient would probably have died much sooner and perhaps been spared much misery. Although physicians do not cause a patient's cancer, say, they repeatedly furnish medical treatments that extend the lives of cancer patients. So I think an argument for a physician-assisted death might appeal to the physician's role prior to the request. And here's one possible way of formulating an argument. And this, again, is an argument in favor of physician-assisted death. The first premise holds that physicians may play a significant role in extending patients' lives to a point where patients' quality of life is poor and they no longer desire to continue living. For some patients, after treatments are stopped, the available options such as palliative and hospice care are inadequate to ensure a good death. In these instances, physicians should or may hasten death because they acted in ways that help bring about the patient's predicament. And here's a variation of this argument that appeals not to the causal contribution the physician made, but to the significant relationship that physicians develop when patients are provided care. And the argument starts off by pointing out that physicians are often stand by a patient's side throughout the course of their illness, which, however long or short, often includes intense emotions, hard choices, and powerful memories of what was said and done. This can create a significant bond between doctor and patient, typically involving the patient knowing, trusting, relying on, and expecting the physician to be there for them. Under these conditions, physicians should or may hasten death, again, if their patient requests it, because they stand in a special relationship with the patient. So arguments that are based on the physician's role or relationship with the patient are, of course, limited in scope. First, they assume that patients have an ongoing illness rather than a sudden or acute event or injury leading to their current state. Second, they assume that doctor-patient relationships are positive and the patient wants them to continue. So clearly, the arguments do not apply to every case. However, they do apply to many cases. Against this first set of arguments, it could be said that ending life has not historically been part of the physician's role. Furthermore, even if physicians have a duty to help, it could be argued that they don't have a duty to help in a particular way, such as assisting death. Finally, it could be said that dying is overly medicalized already, and we should reduce, not expand, medicine's role at the end of life. So let me turn to a second family of arguments for physician-assisted death, and these arguments hold that actions to end life are morally, not just conceptually, but morally equivalent to withholding life-sustaining treatment, and we routinely withhold life-sustaining treatment. So the claim here is that even if there is a conceptual difference between omitting life-saving interventions and acting to hasten death, there's no moral difference. And one reason there may be no moral difference is that the goal and outcome are similar. Here's an argument that draws on this alleged moral equivalence. First, acting and omitting are morally equivalent when the goal and consequences are similar. Next, at the end of life, the goal and consequences of stopping life-sustaining treatment are often quite similar to the goal and consequences of hastening death. Under these conditions, if stopping life-sustaining treatment is allowed, then hastening death should be or may be as well. One limitation of this argument is that the moral equivalence thesis is not universally accepted. In particular, it has limited application outside the West. This is a study of end-of-life practices in intensive care units across Asia, and Fao and colleagues reported that many physicians saw a distinction between acting and omitting, a moral distinction. In general, physicians were much more likely to omit life-sustaining treatment, so to withhold, than to perform the act of withdrawing it. So that suggests acting and omitting are viewed as morally different. A final group of arguments in favor of physician-assisted death holds that just as using futile interventions can lead to an undignified dying process after futile interventions are stopped, symptoms associated with end-stage disease can also cause a profound loss of dignity. Dignity, in fact, is one of the most frequently reported end-of-life concerns for US patients with terminal illness who request assisted dying. And this is the latest figures available from the state of Oregon, where 68.1% from this state in 2021 cited dignity. While terminally ill patients, when they were asked about their specific dignity concerns, they reported concerns related to reduced capabilities for thinking, moving independently, and interacting with family. And often a tipping point is reached for patients when serious illness leads to permanent capability loss in areas that matter most. A dignity-based argument for assisted dying might be formulated drawing on these concerns along the following lines. First, respecting dignity requires supporting patients' threshold capacities, the ones cited, such as capacities for thinking, moving independently, interacting with family and friends. Serious illness can interfere with patients' capacities and it can undermine dignity. Therefore, respecting patients' dignity may require or allow offering patients alternatives, including hastening death. Now, one concern with dignity-based arguments is that focusing on helping patients die might move the spotlight away from efforts to help patients with serious illness live better lives. A related concern is that a right to die may lead us down a slippery slope, encouraging a perception, at least, that there's a duty to die, especially perhaps among marginalized groups, such as older adults, racial and ethnic minorities, and others who may feel subtly coerced to end their lives. So in summary, The arguments for physician-assisted death that I have presented appeal to the physician's special role and relationships with the patient, the conceptual and moral equivalence of acting and omitting, and respect for patient dignity. These arguments, I believe, establish important ways in which medical futility and physician-assisted death interrelate. They occur together, they overlap conceptually, and they both link to dignity. So in conclusion, people who take on the role of doctoring have a duty to withhold and withdraw medically futile life-sustaining treatments. And in some instances, I believe they may be permitted to hasten death if patients request this. These duties, I've argued, relate directly to medicine's goal of benefiting the patient. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Nancy Jacker. Now it's time for our panel discussion. May I invite our moderator, Dr. Derek Au, Professor Roger Chong, and Dr. John Zhong to come out and be seated.
Okay, we have just 20 minutes for the panel discussion, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, which is not much time for either one. You have heard 4 presentations, which are, again, content not just rich, but quite dense. Some of the arguments and points being raised are quite complex and not easily sorted out in a very brief period of time. But let me just start with 2 notes, perhaps to help focus on the subsequent discussion and also the Q&A. One is related to the distinction between passive and active euthanasia. Okay, John has already referred to this being not so distinct in some countries. In Japan and mainland China, sometimes the two can be quite blurred. In Hong Kong, it's quite clear distinguished. I can actually say that within the healthcare field and among clinicians and healthcare professionals, passive euthanasia is no longer used as a concept in practice. So the issue, that's too strong a statement. At least I should say that withholding and withdrawing life-sustaining treatment is considered a separate issue in clinical ethics and also in practice, and not merged together with passive euthanasia in discussion. So I think that's why in Hong Kong, perhaps the contentious issue, the issue worth discussion is really the active euthanasia part, and that's what I propose to focus on when we talk about euthanasia in the present discussion. Secondly, is related to Professor Lee's observation on slippery slope. I noticed that he referred to some early references in Netherlands and other countries which did not show clearly empirical evidence for slippery slope happening. But I think in recent publications and evidence, it's now quite clear that at least in countries like Canada and also in Belgium and some perhaps also in some early changes in Netherlands, there are actually quite clear empirical evidence that slippery slope does occur. Okay, it will be extended to consider in dementia and minor and children, minors, and other subjects. So that's just to clarify the fact. But that doesn't take away Professor Lee's point, the other point that even if it does occur in some countries, it does not mean that it will necessarily have to happen in our local place. So it's not as such an argument to say that we should never consider PAS in our local community. So I think that's just to clear the 2 points. So let me first start the discussion, perhaps from a lead from Nancy. She really eloquently showed that the issue of medical fertility and also assisted dying, assisted suicide, assisted death are in some way quite related. Whereas sometimes we like to think that keep distance from the issue of euthanasia and just focus on improving life care. That seems to be two schools of thoughts that we should put them as far apart as possible. And in the other school of thought, we should consider the two together. So I just like to invite the speakers in turn to perhaps say a few words on what you think on putting together as a discussion or even policy consideration or putting them together as discussion. Roger, any thoughts
Should
on
I
this?
start?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you for the question, and I think this is a great question. Well, the question that you're asking is more like a empirical ethics kind of question, right? You're asking for what I think when I hear Nancy talk about those arguments. I think they should be talked together. I mean, you know, because futile treatments is, for me, you know, you cannot take them apart and say they are two separate issues. I think one of the very convincing points that Professor Jacker made is, well, the patients probably didn't ask for their life being sustained at the first place or prolonged. The availability of these medical technologies allow them their lives to be sustained, whereas, you know, if we're going back to history, this option wasn't available, right? So in that case, for me, you know, this argument is very convincing that doctors are also responsible. There's at least some level of responsibility towards a request, a genuine request from someone who is eminently dying and acting on his or her autonomy and really believe that this pain and suffering is unbearable. I think there is some strong arguments. That's a strong argument there.
So there's a responsibility to consider both, perhaps not necessarily as the same issue, but both are important issues.
Yeah.
John, you have any thoughts on whether euthanasia can be isolated as perhaps, for instance, a for and against kind of arguments without considering end-of-life care, or do you think the two are related as well?
Know too much so about it.
You did observe in the literature review that in some countries that the availability of healthcare is related to people's acceptance of euthanasia, right? In mainland China, you mentioned health insurance issue. In one of the other talks, there's also issue, some of the speakers also mentioned the issue whether end-of-life care may make people more likely or less likely to accept. So I think empirically, perhaps there's also some linkage there. Nancy, have I fairly reflected your thought on this, or you want to add a few more words on this?
Yeah, very much so. You've reflected my thoughts on this. Look, the larger context is the relationship between the doctor and the patient, and all of this occurs in tandem. So it needs to be discussed in tandem as the relationship evolves. Mm-hmm. It doesn't occur in isolation or outside of any context. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lee expressed that very eloquently when he talked about the contextual nature of these ethical problems. We don't consider them from, you know, the 30,000-foot level. We are embedded in relationships, in culture, in context. So I think that it's critical to remember that and not just look at, you know, I introduced some arguments, but it's important not to look at them as propositions that sort of stand or hover above everything else. They are embedded in a relationship in this instance, and that is really what foregrounds all of these concerns.
So really seeing it in the context of the relationship between doctors and patients. And Han,
yeah.
You have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, can I respond to? I have actually 3 points. Can I, you know, make first of all the slippery slope? Actually, okay, sure. I mean, slippery slope argument. I don't mean to say there's no slippery slope at all. But as a philosopher called Bernard Williams says, if there's a slippery slope, you want slide a little bit, that's okay. So as long as we don't lie from the current position to allowing a 17-year-old who fall out of love to have assisted suicide. So and in between, there's a lot of room for the courts, for example, to decide when to draw the line. But I think the easiest case is the assisted death, PAD, in the case of someone who is terminally ill, experiencing unbearable suffering, and repeatedly want to die. So that's the first point. And the second point I'd like to say is I think there's still some use. I mean, I totally understand the medical position that they don't want, by euthanasia, they don't mean passive euthanasia. It's actually a philosopher's term, right? But actually, the passive euthanasia does not only include refusal and withdrawing, but also, very importantly, the case when alleviating the pain of a patient could lead to his or her death. The reason why this is important is it has been argued persuasively, to my mind, that there's no, as Nancy rightly said, no distinction, no more distinction could be defended, as long as we can see that, if we allow the third case of passive euthanasia, that is alleviating a patient's pain, foreseeing that he or she will die, if we think that is okay, and that is okay under the current law, right, in most countries, it cannot be defended. Of course, we don't have time today to go into it. I mean, the gist of the argument is intention cannot figure into a permissibility argument. So we cannot say, oh, this is allowed, that's not allowed, because one is intended, the other one is not. I think that has been defended very well by people like Judith Thompson and Tim Scanlon. Okay, finally, I want to say I couldn't agree more with Nancy on most of her point, but there's one tiny little bit that I'm just wondering, and I appreciate very much your argument about the doctor-patient relation, and also the permissibility and responsibility to have assisted death. But I'm just wondering, suppose there's a doctor who is very religious, let's say, and he said, according to my religion, active euthanasia is disallowed. Would you say, even in that case, he or she is responsible, or do you want to soften it to say that, outside of this case? I'm just wondering, what's your response?
Yeah, Nancy?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So I would draw an important distinction between what's ethically permissible and what's ethically mandatory. And the arguments that I presented were designed primarily to show that it's permissible. And it doesn't necessarily impose a duty upon any particular provider or physician to participate. And certainly, as a matter of personal or professional integrity, they might perceive that they have other duties that would forbid them from doing so. So in countries like my own, certain states in the US where, for example, physician-assisted death in the form of assisted suicide, although some people don't like that term, but where the patient self-administers a lethal dose of medication, physician can refrain from prescribing it if it violates their own deeply held personal convictions. So no one is requiring anyone to request assisted death or to participate in it on the other end as the physician.
Yes, this, by the way, is also quite a hot topic in Canada. Conscientious objection, when the law actually requires physicians to do quite a lot with the new system of medical aid in dying. So, but that's, I think that's another issue. I think Han has anticipated how I would like to moderate the next perhaps 10, 15 minutes. And I was going to open up the time for the speakers to see if they have any thoughts based on what they heard from the other speakers, to sort of let it free flow a little bit.
I was just going to follow up with what Nancy and Han just discussed, right? So based on personal conviction, religious conviction, if there's a choice for the doctor not to perform euthanasia, then what if, this is just a hypothetical scenario. What if the patient has no other choice, right? So he let's just say that he's not very well connected, right? He's only seeing this doctor, and he's not going to change to another doctor. And this doctor is saying, I'm not going to do it for you. I'm not going to ask my colleagues to do it for you. This is my religious conviction. And it seems like then he doesn't, have his rights to die in that sense, in that particular scenario. I just want to hear what Nancy has to say about that kind of scenario. Probably it is a justice issue in that case.
Well, that's an important question because it speaks to the practicality and the logistics of, operationalizing this, that in some instances, someone excusing themselves from participating because it violates their personal convictions or religious beliefs might foreclose the opportunity for the patient to have access. And that's true not just with respect to assisted death, but it's also true with respect to other end-of-life services, or such as terminal sedation, or abortion services and reproductive services. So there's a tension in terms of the provider and the patient in this instance, and I think the larger healthcare system should address that. It doesn't always do a good job, but I think that that's a problem at another level in the system.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other mutual comments or observations?
Yes.
Yeah, John.
Actually, I'm quite interested in Professor Jacker's topic. So I prepared a question for Professor Jacker. And my question is, what is the role of patient's autonomy in assisted death? As you have mentioned, there are two kinds of assisted death. One is omit to act. Another is hastened death. It seems patient's autonomy plays a small role in the first case. It is permissible for physician to withdraw the fetal treatment without patient's consent. Instead, in East Asia, most cases of passive euthanasia are performed under policy decision, such as the patient's wife made decision for her husband who fall into reversible coma. However, hastened death is usually permissible only if the patient himself agreed to be killed. For example, the physician assisted to suicide. And therefore, patient's autonomy is necessary condition for hastened death. I'm wondering what makes these two cases so different. If patient's autonomy is more important than medical futility, is it permissible to withdraw the non-futile or useful treatment at the request of the patient? Or if medical futility is more important than patient's autonomy, is it permissible to hasten the death of the patient at the request of his family for the physician reasonably hold a false belief that the medical treatment is futile?
So that's placing medical futility and autonomy opposite to each other to see how you would consider it in terms of the scenarios that John talked about. It's a kind of long question. I don't know whether Nancy got the question or not.
I think I did. I'll try to do justice to it. So I believe that respecting patient autonomy is consistent with withdrawing fetal treatment, even if the patient or family demands it. And the reason has to do with the way in which I understand autonomy and respect for patient autonomy. It entitles a patient who has the capacity and is informed and so forth to choose from among a range of medically reasonable, medically appropriate options, or to reject all options. It does not entitle the patient to whatever they want on demand. A patient might demand all kinds of things that a medically competent physician would not provide. What they're entitled to choose from is a range of medically appropriate treatments, medically indicated treatments, beneficial treatments. And I believe that when a treatment is quantitatively or qualitatively futile, it doesn't fall within the purview of the autonomous patient's choice. So I would draw a distinction there in terms of the scope of autonomy is limited. Does that address your question?
Hey, can I say something?
Yeah, on, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I totally agree with Nancy, but I just want to make one more point to say that the idea, the role of autonomy is not absent in, let's still call it the passive euthanasia case, okay? For example, if someone wants to die and in a country where active for euthanasia or assisted suicide is illegal, he or she still has to okay passive euthanasia. So I don't think it's absent. It's absent only in the case of medical futility, but outside of medical futility, the role of autonomy is still very important in both passive and active cases.
I would just add that I think often when patients or families insist on, everything possible be done, it really is because doing everything symbolizes, sadly, for some patients and families, it symbolizes caring. But I would argue that there are other and better ways to care. And we see that in countries such as Belgium, where they have excellent palliative care services available and widely used, that the requests and demands for fetal interventions are much less common.
Let me take the liberty to move to Q&A
Sure.
Time, because I noticed that we have just a few minutes left for the panel discussion part, and I'm receiving two really good questions from online audience. So if the speakers permit, I would directly go into the Q&A.
Please.
And then we'll go from there. Okay, and then I'll open to the floor as well. Okay, so there's a question by Elsie Hui. She would like to invite Professor Jacker's view on the success of promotion of end-of-life care in a general litigious society. I suppose that's referring to the States, where people do sue each other. She was thinking of a recent case in Hong Kong, where two Hong Kong doctors were charged with medical manslaughter for a medical error. And it really, in her words, does send a chill down the spines of many among the medical profession. So if physicians can become liable, even with medical errors, to be prosecuted for medical manslaughter, what does that say for a society which is even more litigious than Hong Kong? Is it a special challenge to promote end-of-life care?
Good question. It is a special challenge to promote end-of-life care in the United States, and we are an extremely litigious society. And in some states that are more conservative, it's more difficult than in others. One of the ways that we've addressed it is to incorporate in hospital policies and the policies of long-term care facilities that fetal interventions are not provided. So that you don't have a provider, a physician sort of standing out on a limb. They can appeal to an ethics committee, a consensus among the medical team, and ultimately the policies of their institution, which support them and limit the scope of what they're required to do. And this is information for courts because it provides expert opinion and policy judgment about appropriate medical care and standards of best medical practice. We also have professional societies, various sorts, bioethics societies, medical societies, nursing societies, who have spoken to this, addressing it from a variety of perspectives. And that too provides information about appropriate care and professional standards to courts. And I think it's drawn on. So we are still in the grips of it, but I think we've made good progress.
Thank you, Nancy. The other question is by Vanessa Yu. She raised a question in patients with chronic mental illnesses that are resistant to most treatment, including medical and electroconvulsive therapy for depression, in severe schizophrenia and depression. Are they eligible to participate in the discussion of PAD? I think actually it's happening in some countries that they wish to or are already including some severe or intractable psychiatric conditions. Some would consider this as a progress. Others will consider this as another sign of a slippery slope to include psychiatric conditions. Perhaps not to the extent of the 17-year-old not finding his love, but certainly in really severe, serious psychiatric conditions. So what do the speakers think on the issue of really severe, serious psychiatric illnesses?
I mean, I would like to hear from our international speakers.
Yeah, Nancy, what do you think on this issue?
Well, some societies might appeal more to suffering than to respect for autonomy, and that might be a basis for considering assisted death of some form in that situation. Others might still invoke autonomy and respect for autonomy and make the claim that, if this patient had prior capacity and they made their wishes known that they wouldn't want to live in this sort of situation, then this is a way of extending autonomy to a now incapacitated patient. So there are different ways of going about making the argument. And there are also alternatives such as terminal sedation and various sorts of comfort care if a patient is really suffering or in pain.
Thank you. Hon, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is perhaps a hard case. But I don't see that if this is legalized is such a bad thing. I think, of course, it's for a community to come together and discuss it for the courts, right? So I don't think I don't think that if some society, maybe the Netherlands, allow this, is a moral disaster. I wouldn't quite say that. I think it's still, it's a little bit down the slippery slope. But I wouldn't say that. Yeah, but I wouldn't say that is already reached the point of no return or something.
Yeah. Okay. So let me, because of the shortage of time, I'd like to leave some time for the floor. Any questions or comments? Also, please keep it short.
Can I take off my mask?
Maybe sure, please.
Easier to talk this way. I'm Jie Zhenyan. Thanks for this speakers for the very good presentation. I'm not going to bring up my own view on the pros or cons on euthanasia, but just want to bring up a few minor points. One is on the definition. Horn talked about that MAID, medical assisted MAID is similar to PASPAD, but actually MAID is inclusive of in Canada. This term is the term used in Canada. Is inclusive of physician-assisted suicide as well as euthanasia. Okay, so just want to clarify that. And then in Horn's presentation, Horn has repeatedly emphasized the patients with endless, unbearable suffering, pain, and so on. I just want to raise that there are alternatives to the relief of pain and suffering other than killing the patient. So palliative care can relieve the pain and suffering of the great majority of patients. And we have to understand that in Canada, for example, the law actually does not require that the patient has unbearable suffering. The law requires that the patient understand that there's an option of palliative care, but he chooses not to relieve the palliative care and want to choose MAID. So it is really up to the patient's choice. The law now, the debate is now moved away from patient with unbearable suffering, has moved to patient who has suffering, who know there are alternatives, but it is the patient's choice or autonomy whether he want to choose palliative care or want to choose MAID. I think most of you understand that in Canada, the law now is not limited to the terminally ill, and will be extended to psychiatric patients in March this year. So very soon. So if we use the term slippery slope, it's gone down the slippery slope in Canada very quickly. Okay. Then one very quick comment on Professor Jacob's presentation. Professor Jacob says the moral equivalence of foregoing futile treatment and euthanasia depend on the outcome. I'll say that for a patient, for example, who is not imminently dying, for example, in psychiatric patients, a choice of euthanasia, the patient will die. If a patient chooses not to relieve life-sustaining treatment, the patient will survive. So the outcome will be very different in this kind of patients. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any immediate thoughts on top of that, or
Okay, can I just say very quickly? I mean, I already talked about this already. I mean, about a slippery slope, right? I think that in the case of, I understand in the Netherlands too, there's no requirement of unbearable suffering, because who can only say that, right? Only the patient. The patient is in a privileged position to say whether he or she is suffering unbearably, right? So actually the court doesn't require that, as far as I know. But in the case of psychiatric cases, right, I would say that, okay, it's down the slippery slope, but it's still on the higher end of the slope, not the lower end of the slope. So I wouldn't think that that is a more disastrous scenario.
Okay, but it's a bit worrying to many of us.
Okay, maybe to you, yeah. Okay.
Okay. Any other comments or thoughts from the audience? Yes, Dawang.
Hello. I think some of us may believe that at least a certain proportion of patients may really benefit from assisted dying, even if we have very good palliative care. Let's just accept that. But should we say that because we can see the situation in Hong Kong right now, the ranking in the quality of death is so low compared to other countries already with the assisted suicide? Should we just say that because of the quality of death here in Hong Kong, due to various reasons, is still not favorable? That may not be the right time for us to discuss legalizing assisted physician-assisted suicide here in Hong Kong. Yeah, particularly that is shown by Dr. Zhong, and also we can see from Dr. Zhong that the situation in China, we can see the acceptance to physician-assisted suicide dropped from around 90% in 1990s to recent years around just 50%, which may be related to the improvement of the quality of care in China. So that may be underlying reason that may be improvement in the palliative care. And that means physician-assisted may not be really necessary if we have good quality of palliative care. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a representative view of many caring professionals in Hong Kong that I know of. And that is, if you look at the Hong Kong local context, when people in the public do sometimes talk about euthanasia, it is often in the context of tragedies where the care system was failing or not helping, and then you have a husband killing the chronically ill wife or terminally ill wife, and then at the same time say, why don't we legalize euthanasia in Hong Kong? In Hong Kong, often the discussion is triggered by this sort of tragic story, which is so deeply intertwined with the issue of inadequate of failure in the system, which I think Raja talked about a lot in his presentation. The system of care, the care levels at different levels are simply too much that is still missing. So I think it's quite common view among healthcare professionals that there's so much that we should be doing, and so it's not perhaps the time to jump to. But I think some would disagree that you can't put this off indefinitely and just say let's improve the healthcare system. Han?
Can I just two things? One is sorry, let's see. One is about the distinction between suffering and pain. Okay, the idea of suffering, the concept of suffering is broader. So even if someone is not suffering from any physical pain, for example, someone who was totally paralyzed, and there was a famous case of Hong Kong where someone was paralyzed and stayed in bed for many years, right? I mean, that is a typical case of unbearable suffering, but not necessarily pain in the narrow sense of the term. For example, someone who was suffering from cancer. So I think one is that. And also another case is, for example, Dr. Jazz mentioned that palliative care can take care of most of the cases, but there are still a minority of cases where, as he admit, that the palliative care cannot take care of. And that's another point that I want to say just now, and that is about, in the case of Hong Kong, right? But that's another reason why we need to talk about assisted suicide, because if you look at the world as a whole, more and more countries, not to mention the European countries, right, which have been quite sympathetic to assisted suicide and euthanasia. But even in cases where, in countries which used to be very resistant to this idea, they have already opened up and adopt more and more this practice. For example, one is the case of the United States. I mean, originally there was only 1 or 2 states, but now there are 11 jurisdictions in the US which allow assisted suicide. And also in the case of Australia, originally there was years ago there was no state in Australia that allow it. But when I look at it yesterday, actually only 1 state in Australia disallow assisted suicide. So that's been quite a lot of change. So I think for that reason, I mean, we need to talk about this. Right?
Yeah, that's putting a note on perhaps the trend in other countries. But by the way, Portugal just voted down euthanasia in public poll in the past few days. So it's not all one-sided.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say one thing very quickly, very, very quickly. It's just that I don't think a discussion on euthanasia or PAS will then undermine the discussions on palliative care, because they are quite related. And I don't know, I just want to, seek another chance for an international perspective on this, because
we can probably plan another seminar.
Okay.
On that. But one concluding observation, I think, from me, well, I don't want to talk about my own position, but one observation is that really, if you look at the discussion internationally and the debates and even the literature academically, the focus is increasingly moving away from purely theoretical, philosophical, pros and cons kind of discussions to empirical, contextual kind of discussions and exploration. Even I think a philosophical thinker like Horn, in his talk, he talked a lot about context and also empirical evidence. So I think really that's perhaps, if we talk about euthanasia in the future, assisted dying, perhaps that's where we want to move to really look carefully at the empirical issues. And in the back of our mind, we should also have a question in mind whether in the end this is an issue for the decision by voting. Right? Some countries have public polls or referendums to guide the policy. Is this the sort of issue that can be easily simplified as a public poll issue, or should it be a more complex deliberative process to discuss and then to really develop the mature views of the community? I think with that, I think we are running slightly over time.
Oh, okay.
So with that, I'd like to pass the mic again to Raja on behalf of the center to say a few words to thank everyone. Sure.
Thank you very much for being here today. Although I really want to hear Professor Jacker's point of view on this point, but we'll talk in emails or something. But thank you very much on behalf of the center and also Dr. Ann Lau here. We cherish the opportunity to be able to discuss very important, morally important, and also practically important questions with all of you. And this is only the beginning. We will definitely look forward to having a series of webinars and seminars in the future. Probably there will be more people later on, because now Hong Kong is finally opening up, and then we can talk face to face. Thank you very much again for all our speakers, Han, Nancy, who's dialing in all the way from America. Thank you very much for bringing this very nice 2 hours of discussions to all our audience today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, for sharing.